Fishing villages along the coast of Ramnad district in Tamil Nadu constitute India's seaweed belt. Seaweed collection is a main source of income in many of the villages. Almost throughout the year, men and women go out to islands nearby to collect seaweed. Factories extract either agar or alginates. All the agar is sold in India and is used mainly in the food industry. There is some concern that the seaweed resource is diminishing through over-exploitation. The Tamil Nadu government has declared islands around the Gulf of Mannar as a marine national park. This may affect the livelihood of the seaweed collectors.
We depend entirely on seaweed collection for our livelihood. We must visit the islands near our villages to collect seaweed.
To improve the incomes of small-scale fisherfolk and also to conserve and strengthen the seaweed resource, the BOBP, in cooperation with the Tamil Nadu Fisheries Department, decided to start seaweed farming on an experimental basis in 2 fishing villages, Vedalai and Chinnapalam. Committees were formed in both villages to implement seaweed farming trials. 25 people in Vedalai village and 20 in Chinnapalam work regularly in the farms and receive nominal wages. BOBP provides materials and technical assistance. The technology for seaweed culture is derived from work of an earlier BOBP project in Penang, Malaysia. How does this technology work? Mature seaweed plants in a plastic tank release spores on raffia or plastic lines. The seeded raffia lines are then transferred to a seaweed farm site where they are tied down between stone posts. An outgrowth of seaweed occurs. However, at mandapam, no outgrowth occurred and the raffia lines remained empty, though the best available expertise was engaged to examine the trials. Spore setting trials were stopped after a year and trials began with vegetative propagation of seaweed. Under this system, seaweed cuttings about 5 centimeters long are inserted into 3 millimeters HDPE rope at suitable intervals. Initial outgrowth from vegetative cuttings was promising despite grazing. In February 1989, 1,000 kg of seaweed were harvested in 4.5 hectare of farm site after 2 to 3 months of growth. However, several problems have plagued seaweed farming trials since then. The main problem is grazing by rabbit fish. Other problems are seaweed decay and fall off, growth of pest algae, extreme low tides and sedimentation.
The fish attack the seaweed lines and eat off all the seaweeds. The lines are stripped bare. This is happening all the time. We don't know what to do.
Fencing seems to be the only way to protect seaweed from grazing. This was done recently in both villages, and a small area of the farm was fenced with net lawn material. Another area was protected by 4 fyke nets. While some rabbit fish get caught in the fyke nets, the grazing of seaweed by rabbit fish continues. The net lawn fence seems to be effective in one village, and seaweed has started growing, much to the delight of the village folk. In the other village, the fence has been partially destroyed by heavy winds, strong currents, and drifting seaweed. Fish slip in through gaps in the fence and graze the seaweed. The project has to find answers to 2 questions. How long will the fence last? And will the seaweed harvested from a fence cover the cost of the fence and give the seaweed farmers a profit? Meanwhile, the project is trying to find out whether agar extraction from seaweed can become a cottage industry. The farmers can obviously get a much better price for agar than for raw seaweed. Usually, seaweed is sold cheaply to agents. The post-harvest treatment is poor. Seaweed is dried on the beach and hence becomes very sandy. The agar-producing seaweed is often found mixed up with other seaweeds which do not yield agar. It is not very costly and also not very difficult to make a platform on which seaweed can be dried so that it will be kept free from sand. If fully dried, seaweed can be stored for a long time. A simple technology to extract agar from seaweed has been developed in Thailand. It is now being tried out in mandapam. The quantity of seaweed processed at one time by this method has to be increased to make agar production more feasible. 2 kilograms of dried seaweed seems to be the maximum amount which can be handled by one person per day. The seaweed is cleaned and soaked for several hours. The cleaned seaweed is boiled on a wood or coconut husk fire, since most village folk do not have a kerosene stove. For 2 kilograms of seaweed, approximately 20 liters of water are needed, and the seaweed is boiled for 2 to 3 hours. The boiled seaweed is filtered through a cotton cloth with the help of a locally made coconut press, which is slightly bigger than that used for this method in Thailand. A few liters of hot water are needed from another fire to preheat the press. One person takes 1.5 to 2 hours to filter 2 kilograms of seaweed, since it must be filtered in batches of 200 grams. The agar takes 2 to 3 hours to set, followed by a second filtration. The coconut press cannot be used because of the big quantity of set agar. The second filtration can be done by placing the agar in a cotton bag between 2 planks with some heavy stones on top. However, it is difficult to extract sufficient water by this method. This means it will take longer for the agar to dry, with the danger of decay or bacterial contamination. The resulting agar is crude and not suitable for direct use in the food industries. Samples of crude agar have been sent to agar factories to find out if there are simple and economic ways of upgrading its quality. BOBP is looking into the costs and earnings of seaweed farming and agar production. It is too early for conclusions, but what we do know is that fencing material is expensive and that it will be hard to produce enough seaweed to cover costs. Agar production could of course be carried out with naturally collected seaweed. But will people be willing to spend so many hours in preparing agar when it is so easy just to sell the seaweed?